Hello. Today's Brown Bag History is on the Japanese Canadian community in Revelstoke. As we begin, we acknowledge that the land around Revelstoke and on the Columbia River and its tributaries is traditional Snaax territory. We acknowledge the ties of the Secwepemc, the Okanagan Nation Alliance, and the Ktunaxa to this land. We acknowledge our use and inhabitation of this land sacred to these four nations. We respectfully honor their traditions and culture. So it's been difficult to really dig into the story of Japanese Canadian settlement and migration to the Revelstoke area. We've been doing a lot of digging recently, and currently, thanks to a grant from the Japanese Canadian Legacies Fund, we've been able to really delve into this history and finding that there's a lot more information out there, a lot more to the story than we realized. I'd like to acknowledge Tomoaki Fujimura, who has, for the last 15 years or so, has really delved into history of the Japanese Canadian settlers, particularly sparked by interest in the people who were impacted by the March 4th, 1910 snowslide at Rogers Pass, and those who died there and those who were working there as well at the time. And that led to Tomo really finding a lot of Japanese Canadian settlers who had come to Canada to work for the railway and in mills, and was able to connect their stories through the years and connect with family members as well. So I thank him for his research. I'm also really indebted to Harumi Sakiyama, who's our archivist at Revelstoke Museum and Archives. And she is working on our research project and has done a tremendous amount of research and collecting of photographs and information from the Japanese Canadian community. So we know that there was Japanese immigration into this area from the 1890s and large waves of immigration to Canada in the early 1900s. Many of them, the Japanese Canadian settlers, settled on the West Coast, but a lot followed jobs wherever they were throughout the province. There was a company called the Nippon Supply Company, which was formed to supply laborers for railway work and in sawmills and other labor jobs in the West, as indicated by this photograph here of a sawmill at Comiplex. According to the 1901 census, I was able to find 17 Japanese Canadians at Ilocos and two at Arrowhead. They were all laborers. They were all men. And at that time, there weren't any indicated living within Revelstoke, although we believe that there were some Japanese Canadian settlers in the town at that time. We know that by the early 1900s, there was Japanese Canadian settlement here. There was even found record of a short-lived Japanese restaurant on First Street East in 1904. A man named Yodo Fuji had the Owl Restaurant, but it only appeared to have been active for a little while in 1904. By 1903, there were a few sex workers and laborers and other Japanese Canadians living in sort of the lower part of town, the Farwell settlement, Front Street and Douglas Street. And we know from one particular story of a woman named Jenny Kiyahara, who was a sex worker. We know that she was in Revelstoke as early as 1903. And in 1905, she was murdered. It was an unsolved murder. It was never It never found her murderer, but it shook the community. And she is buried in the Mountain View Cemetery at Revelstoke. And when I've been doing cemetery tours there for decades, And we first came across the story of Jenny. We started talking about her story, and people were very moved by it. We found out, her marker in English simply says Jenny Japanese. And in the Japanese characters, it gives her date, her age is 24. So a young woman brutally murdered, and you could see there her marker was wearing away. And so there was a project done through Arts Revelstoke and LunaFest to restore her grave and to honor her. So the local artist Sarah Spur did an art installation with an animation about Jenny, and there's a little web page created about her life, and then this marker was the base was restored. The marker on top is the original marker. It was just cleaned and replaced on the new marble base, and a little bit of telling a little bit about Jenny's story there. So it was a way to honor her. It was a sad story, and one of the newspapers at the time reported that the Japanese and women in the neighborhood were not cooperating with the police because they didn't believe she was worth hanging a man for. So, a short, sad life. And I think people in the community here who hear her story are always moved by it. So this was a way to recognize that she was seen and heard and honored. In between 1904 and 1943, I found records of 34 Japanese people who died in Revelstoke and another 12 who died east of the town, mostly in railway-related accidents. Now, according to the records, approximately 22 of those people are buried in Revelstoke, and not all of them have markers. And only about 10 of those who died were mentioned in the local newspapers. And some newspaper accounts of the deaths of Japanese people didn't even mention their names. So you'd have to find that through the Vital Events Index. The Mail Herald of April 15th, 1908, reported an accident at Downey siding east of Revelstoke, and 4 men were killed and 6 injured in that incident. There were a crew of 18 Japanese men in sleeper cars at Downey siding, which is 15 miles east of Revelstoke. And an avalanche swept down the mountainside and hit the cars. They had believed that the cars were in a safe spot, but the avalanche came down a new path and hit the car. 4 of the men died of suffocation, and 6 others were badly bruised. The deceased men were all buried in Revelstoke. And of course, we're aware of the major avalanche in Rogers Pass on March 4th, 1910, that killed 58 railway workers. 32 of those men were Japanese. And it's been project, we've been really involved in trying to find more about all of the men who died. And thanks to the research by Tomo, we were able to put together profiles of all of the men, and including all of the 32 Japanese workers. So we know their ages, we know where they were from in Japan, a little bit about them, when they came to Canada. So we have all that information available, thanks to the work of Tomo. But it certainly had a big impact on the community, on the Japanese Canadian community, and was just, well, it was the largest loss of life in an avalanche event in Canada. So the community had a memorial service, and this is the copy of the inside of the program of the memorial service that was held in the community. And even at that time, they separated the Japanese men from the Caucasian men who died. But we do have, as I say, now we do have records of all of them, and we know all of their names and a little bit about all of them now. And when we did a commemoration of the event, the snowslide in on March 4th, 2010, we were able to honor all of the men equally and included a Buddhist ceremony as well as Christian hymns and to just to make sure that everybody was honored in a way that reflected their lives. All of the Japanese men who died, their bodies were sent to Vancouver, and they were buried at Vancouver's Mountain View Cemetery. And their graves are all still there. They're all marked. There was the Mountain View Cemetery also did a commemoration service in 2010 and made sure that the graves were properly recognized. So this was a service for Masatura Abe and one other man. The men were sent as the bodies were found, so there were multiple funerals and burials held in Vancouver. And just like to mention that currently filmmaker Chad Townsend and working with Tomo Fujimura and Morgan Brewster, whose grandfather or great grandfather was a roadmaster with the CPR at the time. They're working on a film on the 1910 snowslide, and we're hoping to see that out later this year. According to the 1910 census, there were quite a few Japanese Canadians throughout the area. There were 28 people from Japan at Three Valley, including two women and a child. And the men were all laborers in the Mundy Lumber Company. At Taft, there were 12 men, one of whom had come to Canada in 1896, and they were working at the sawmill at Taft. In Malacca, there were 40 men, railway workers, possibly working on a bridge project there. Six men at the lumber mill at Arrowhead and 34 at the lumber mill at Comiplex. This is showing the crew at Comiplex, which was just around the northeast arm of the Upper Arrow Lakes, around from just up from Arrowhead, up the arm. And that mill was there until 1915 when it was burned down in an arson fire. At Revelstoke, there were um, people living in boarding cars east of Revelstoke. There were 24 that I was able to find, including one woman. This is Kunitaro Hashimoto. Uh, that he was about age 28 in 1911, and he married his first wife Fude in um, uh, in Victoria, and then they came to back where he was already working, back to the rail crew just east of Revelstoke. He was a bookman, which meant that he was in charge of a crew and was in charge of keeping the records for his crew. And that meant he was educated. He was literate in both English and Japanese, so that he could keep accurate records and keep track of the crew that he was responsible for. He was born in 1883 and had come to Canada in 1906. Um, he was his first wife died in 1923, and then Kunitaro went back to Japan and married Hisa Nishino. And they had six children. Um, and the old one of the sons, Kunio, still lives in Revelstoke, and uh, his brothers Keen and Yoshi are at the coast, and we've spoken to them and visited with them several times. They provided us with a lot of information and photographs on the family. Initially, when Hisa came, she lived with her husband in a boarding car east of town and worked as a, a cook for the crew. And as was quite common on the railway sidings where there were men working, the bears would come looking for handouts. So there's Hisa Hashimoto actually feeding a bear on the siding. Just flip back to this photograph. This was a photograph of this is a Kunitaro Hashimoto and his brother as part of a CPR steel gang near Armstrong in 1940. So the Hashimoto's eventually built a house on Humbert Street and raised their family there. Um, Hisa went to Japan and studied a massage treatment and using some electric equipment, and then came back and started a practice in Revelstoke. One of her clients was the well-known local artist Sophie Atkinson, an internationally acclaimed artist, and Sophie gave several of her paintings to Hisa, and several of those have been donated to the museum by Hisa's children. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and when the Japanese workers were pulled off the railway, uh, Yoshi said that the younger son said that they had a large vegetable garden which helped them survive. And his father went to work for the McKinnon Standard Dairy Farm for a while, and also worked as a flagman on for road construction. So they managed to make it through before he was able to get his railway job back. The son Cunio, who still lives in town, worked as a roadmaster with the CPR. Um, so he did very well working for the railway company. The Takehashi family was also a very early family in Revelstoke. Choichiro Takahashi was in British Columbia by 1908, working as a CPR section foreman. And we know that he was in Revelstoke by about 1910, 1911. Some of his children were born in Revelstoke. For a while, his father, Shotaro, also lived in Revelstoke and lived here in his old age until he passed away. One of their sons, Ryozo, also known as Leo, was born in Revelstoke in 1915, the son of Choichiro and his wife Sue. He was a baker for Gallicano's Bakery and owned the business for 5 years. He went back to Japan for a while, and in 1953 came back with his wife Iko and his children Sho and Ayako. Sho lived in Revelstoke until 2007 and worked as a mechanic. He married Hozumi Nakamura, whose family had come here in the early 1940s. They raised two children here, and so there was actually 5 generations of the Takahashi family who lived in Revelstoke over the years. Just recently, I learned about a man named Kusamatsu Shiosaki, and he and his wife Tora lived in Revelstoke probably about 10 years or so in the early 1900s. And Kusamatsu was the farm manager for the C.B. Hume Ranch near Williamson's Lake. C.B. Hume had a big department store where the Royal Bank is now at the corner of First and Mackenzie. And he had his sold his apples and strawberries and other produce that he grew on his own ranch. And with Mr. Shiosaki as the manager, so they had children born here in 1911 and 1913. By the 1920s, they relocated to Kelowna. But interesting story. Last year, I had a visit from a woman named Bernice Shiosaki, and um, the Kusumatsu was her grandfather, and her father was born. It was a younger son, was born in Kelowna, but she also told me that she heard that her uncle Nelson, who was born in Revelstoke in 1913, had died near Revelstoke in the late 1950s. So we found his death in 1959. And the obituary talked about Mr. Shiosaki working for C.B. Hume, and that Nelson had been born in Revelstoke at the time. We also found records from the Spanish flu in the worldwide pandemic, and in 1918 and early 1919. In Revelstoke, there was over 30 people who died as a result of the Spanish flu, and six of them were Japanese Canadians, including two women and two children. We also recently found out about the Mizuta family. Um, Jizaburo Mizuta and his wife Tane came to Revelstoke in the early 1930s, and Jizaburo was working as a bookman. Their son Haruji was born in Revelstoke in 1933, and their daughter Asako in 1936. They lived mostly in boarding cars between Revelstoke and Field. On March 2nd, 1936, there was a major railway accident at near Illecillewaet, east of Revelstoke. The railway crew was clearing a snowslide, and they'd created the plow had gone through and created a cut. So most of the men were working inside the cut, shoveling snow out of off of the tracks, and the railway engine was pulling a, a railway tender away from the slide area. It was going up an incline, and the engine had suddenly braked. I think the engineer possibly thought another slide was coming down, and the tender was not attached correctly, and it detached from the engine, the locomotive, and started to roar back down into this cut. And it hit a lot of the men who were working inside the cut, and 16 of them died. Four of them were Japanese Canadian laborers. Jizaburo was badly injured, but survived. He was able to just pull himself away from the tender just as it was going through, but was had a broken leg. He was sent to the hospital in Revelstoke to recover. And while he was still in hospital, his wife came into the hospital to deliver their daughter, Asako. The family moved to Japan for a while, but Jizaburo returned to Canada and was briefly held in a work camp at Salsqua during World War II. He was later exiled to Japan, but the whole family eventually returned to Canada. And Haruji and Asako are still living at the coast, and they've provided us with these wonderful family photographs of their time in Revelstoke. So in December of 1941, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, and that brought Japan into the Second World War. So Canada declared war against Japan, along with the other allies. And the response from the government was was extreme. Initially, they were going to sort of determine who amongst the Japanese Canadian population could possibly be a risk, and in turn them or remove them from the coast. But the decision was made to remove all Japanese persons and persons of Japanese racial origin from the 100-mile protected zone on the west coast of British Columbia. So everybody who was living on the coast was forcibly uprooted. There were family camps created throughout the interior, um, at places like the around Grand Forks area, all through the Kootenays, Kaslo, Slocan, Sandon, um, Lemon Creek, New Denver, all throughout that area, the camps were created, and whole families were moved into these camps, regardless of whether they were Canadian citizens or not. A lot of them were born in Canada, but they were still forcibly uprooted as part of this policy by the government, which definitely had a strong economic element to it as well. A lot of the Japanese settlers had fishing fleets. They had businesses, they had stores, they had vehicles. Those were all confiscated. So the people profited by that forced uprooting, and by the confiscation of property and businesses. There's no question about that. So as part of that, Revelstoke did not have family camps, but they did have work. There were work camps created here between Revelstoke and Sicamous, where where men were placed, and they were forced to work on the highway between Revelstoke and Sicamous to upgrading of the highway. There were camps at Solsqua, Yard Creek, Griffin Lake, Taft, and Three Valley. By early 1942, the camps were filling up. Uh, in a tragic incident on April 16th, 1942, a young man, Yoshio Shirashi, age 21, died in Three Valley Lake after falling in and was not able to get out and drowned in the lake. There was the camp at Griffin Lake. There was a letter written by one of the young men who was interned in the camp. Wrote a letter to a newspaper at Caslo. It was a Japanese Canadian newspaper called the New Canadian that was being published by some of the people who were interned at Caslo. And he stated that there were 51 people in the Griffin Lake camp, ranging in age from 16 to 58. 14 of them were naturalized citizens, and the rest were Canadian born. And as I say, a lot of young men who were forced into labor. The one of the projects that Tomo has been working on is to connect people who were working for the railway in 1910 to people who were interned in the camp. So he's done a tremendous amount of work, created spreadsheets sort of tracking those connections, and there are definitely a lot of connections there. This drawing was created by a young man named Frank Moritsugu, who was interned at this time. It was at the Yard Creek camp at Malakwa. And in July 1942, it was reported that there were 500 Japanese Canadians in the 7 camps between Revelstoke and Sicamous. But by July 1944, the camps were mostly closed. The men were sent other places to family camps or dispersed throughout the area. Some were sent to Alberta, Manitoba. But the camps were basically closed by July of 1944. But they did a lot of work on the road and were not very well compensated for it because they were considered enemy aliens. As I mentioned, there weren't family camps in Revelstoke, but there were several Japanese Canadians who came to Revelstoke. If they had independent means, were able to move outside of the exclusion zone independently, they could get permission to do that. They had to get permission from the RCMP to move, but a lot of families were able to do that. Saijiro and Yuno Wakita had been in Revelstoke since about 1912 and had established a really thriving general merchant store in Steveston on the coast. They had a storefront, they had their delivery van, so it was really, really thriving business. They were doing very well. They had 6 daughters and 2 sons born between 1911 and 1931. They were uprooted to Revelstoke in April of 1942 with their 4 youngest children. And they lived on the south end of Downey Street, close to, not too far from where the the Downey Street Sawmills operation is now. The City Council of Revelstoke at the time did not allow any of the Japanese Canadians who were coming to town looking for sanctuary and shelter. They did not allow them to live within the city limits. There were several land property owners who approached City Hall saying that they had Japanese Canadian renters who wanted to rent their property, but they were denied. At that time, though, the city limits was at Downey Street. So anything south of Downey Street was outside of the city limits. Big Eddy was outside of the city limits at that time. So most of the Japanese Canadian families who were coming into this area were living south of Downing Street or in the Big Eddy. And we know that during the war years, there were approximately 60 families who lived here at least some point during those war years. But the Wakitas established themselves here, and while they were interned, they established a strawberry farm on their property, and that was how they were making a living during the war years. On this, you can see, looks like pretty thriving strawberry plants there. Revelstoke at that time was actually known for strawberry production. It was one of the major crops here, and the strawberries were sent to Calgary and to other markets. So after the war, um, Seijiro Wakita purchased the Bregalisi grocery store in 1947. It was located on 2nd Street East, where Burisky Park is now located. Uh, they kept the name Bregolisi for a while until some of the antagonism towards Japanese Canadian settlers was starting to wane a little bit, and then they renamed it Wakita's General Store, and they had an apartment upstairs, and they moved in there. That store was in operation until about 1965. But when they started their store, they did meet with some opposition. In June of 1947, two members of the local Legion went to City Hall and asked City Council not to issue business licenses to Japanese Canadian business people. They didn't want any Japanese businesses operating within the city. The council debated that, and they actually looked into any federal legislation, and they were told that there was there were no federal restrictions on Japanese people purchasing property in Canada or operating businesses in Canada. But they did vote on it, and they could only disallow a business license if they had a unanimous vote. Four of the councillors wanted to refuse issuing business licenses to Japanese Canadians. Two of them voted to allow it. So because it wasn't unanimous, they did issue business licenses to Japanese Canadian business people. So we had the Wakitas had their business. They this when they lived on 2nd Street, one of their sons, Uke, was a member of the Spikes baseball team, and the Spikes were, beloved local team. So he was a member of the Spikes team. In 1952, the family opened up another store at on 2nd Street West. There's a newer building there. It's the on 2nd Street West, but they moved there, opened up the frozen food lockers, and that was a very popular business because at that time, a lot of people didn't have home freezers. A lot of the families who lived in the farming areas like Mount Cartier community, south of Revelstoke, a lot of them didn't have electricity. So having access to frozen food lockers was a real boon for a lot of families. So it was a very popular business, and that opened there in 1952. They'd purchased the building from Taikichi Amano in 1951. I'll talk about the Amano business in a little while. And then they also opened the Red and White supermarket in August of 1959. And that building is still there. It was actually just opened recently as Flourish Bakery. So there's a new business in there. But Red and White was kind of it was the corner store in the downtown area for a long time. The members of the family continued to run it. Daughter Mas Wakita married Bill Ora, and they ran the Red and White store. It was damaged by a fire in 1994, And after that time, it was used as a bingo hall for a little while. And as I say, it's now Flourish Bakery. Masora is the only surviving member of the 8 children of Saijiro and Una Wakita. The youngest daughter, Yaya Wakita, married Dennis Hayashi, who came to Revelstoke in 1947. And Dennis worked with his cousin Fuji Sakayama for Pratolini Construction and then later bought the business. Dennis and Yai opened Gail Jean Ladies Wear on 2nd Street East in 1972. And then when Alpine Village Mall opened in 1977, they opened Daspy Fashions, women's clothing, and Style Trend men's clothing. The Amano family was living in Revelstoke during the war. They were forcibly uprooted here in 1942. And through Tomo's research, we discovered that the young man named Noburo Amano died in a truck accident in Three Valley Lake on New Year's Eve. They had his initial wrong here. It was a G. His name was Noburo. And it mentions in the obituary that his parents lived on Downey Street. And he was working on the road crew, but was returning to Revelstoke with a crew of other people, and their truck went into Three Valley Lake, and his body was never recovered. Before the war, Noburo's family had sent him to Japan to learn how to make tamari and miso using traditional brewing methods. And so they were planning on opening a business in Vancouver. And of course, that didn't happen because of the war. But in 1947, Noburo's father, Taichi Amano, opened a Tiamano Company at 413 2nd Street West. And they began manufacturing soybean sauce, bean, and rice products. And in 1951, after the younger son, Shigeru Amano, graduated from high school, the family moved to Vancouver, and Amano Foods is still operating under the direction of Shigeru's son, Graham. There's this, Graham and his wife, Linda, visited the museum in 2022 and gave us some of their products. You can actually purchase the Amano products at Southside Southside Foods. Another really prominent Japanese-Canadian family in Revelstoke were the Shoji family. Roy Aitaro Shoji and Matsu Toriya were married in Japan in 1929, and they came to Vancouver, where their 4 oldest sons were born. Roy founded the Vancouver Paper Box Company. In 1942, they were forcibly uprooted to Minto, which was a self-supporting Japanese-Canadian internment camp in the Bridge River Valley. In November of 1944, the family was granted permission to come to Revelstoke. They wanted to have access to better schools and a hospital and other services that weren't available at Minto. The 2 younger children, Elmer and Sheila, were born in Revelstoke. In 1945, Roy Shoji opened his first Snow White laundry business at Garden and 2nd, and in 1946 moved it to the corner of Orton and Victoria Road. His son Yash was appointed assistant manager in 1958. The Shoji family created a Japanese room in their home above the laundry. Matsu Hashimoto, a friend of the family, created the room, gathering material from the forest, and assembled it by hand without using a single nail. They had a koi pond and plants in there. They imported rice paper for the screen doors, tatami mats, beddings, and adornments from Japan for the room. And they would have, it was a way for them to keep their culture alive. They invited guests to the room to share their culture. Both Roy and Yash were very involved in the community. Both of them served on city council as aldermen, and involved in the Rotary Club and the Golf Club and a lot of other organizations around town, and really contributed to the community in a big way. And the son Elmer still lives, and his family still live in Revelstoke. This is Sab and Aki Yamamoto and Terry and Yash Shoji in Rogers Pass in 1960s. Sab and Aki moved to Revelstoke from Vernon in the early 1960s, where Sab was working for initially for Snow White Laundry. And Aki is still living in Revelstoke now. There was a family that lived in the Big Eddy for quite a few years, the Tsuchiya family, Hajime and Suki. They were forcibly uprooted to Big Eddy in 1942. And one of their daughters, Eleanor, married a man named Mike Maruno. And he was in the Baseball Hall of Fame, was a former member of the well-known Japanese Asahi baseball team at Vancouver, and then became involved in, played with the Revelstoke Spikes and other Revelstoke ball baseball teams here, and was very well revered as a baseball player. The town loved baseball, so he was very well respected because of his skills as a baseball player. They eventually moved to Ontario. Fuji Sakayama came to Revelstoke in 1942, was forcibly uprooted here, and he began working for Pratolini Brothers Construction. Pratolini Brothers was owned by Mario and Elio Pratolini, who were the sons of Anselmo Pratolini, who's an early Italian contractor here. He was one of the major contractors on the courthouse. He built the big towered house family home on 2nd Street East, built a lot of the businesses in downtown Revelstoke. So it was a really well-respected company. And they, during the war, they hired several of the Japanese Canadian men who had been uprooted here. And Fuji, and this is with his wife, Eleanor here, they eventually bought the business from the Pratolini brothers, and it became Revelstoke Builder Supply. They had moved to a building on which now houses Padrino's Pizza on 1st Street West, and then later bought a building on Campbell Avenue. The business was eventually became what's now Home Hardware, but has moved since as well. They brought up their 4 children in Revelstoke. Glenn and Harumi Sakayama still live in Revelstoke. Glenn runs Battersby's Plumbing. His older brother, Kerry Sakayama, is currently the president of the Vancouver Japanese Canadian Citizens Association. The Fujino family, Masakichi and Mitsu, were uprooted to Revelstoke in 1942. Their son, Hideo or Frank, married Helen in Slocan in 1943. And then they later came to Revelstoke, where Frank worked as a carpenter. They had 2 children born in Slocan, and then 4 more born in Revelstoke. And son Norm still lives in Revelstoke, and the other family members are not too far away as well. And we had several of them at the talk. We appreciated them coming. The Okamura family, Fujio or Fred, was born in Japan in 1907 and came to Canada in 1925, working as a fisherman, tractor and caterpillar driver, and mining camp cook. He put his hand to pretty much everything. They were forcibly uprooted to Vernon in 1942, and he married Soto Yamada, or also known as Mary, in 1943. They moved to Revelstoke just after the war in 1946 with 3 children, and had 3 more born in Revelstoke. They built a house at 318 Townley Street, and their daughter Jean and her husband Louis Deschamps are still living in that house now. He worked for CPR as a gardener when they had their beautiful gardens at the station. He worked in maintenance at the high school, worked as a bartender at the Legion, was very involved in the community. Also had a janitorial service for a while, and he taught judo classes and was active in the tennis club and curling club. And just prior to his death, he was cited as one of the oldest members of both the tennis club and the curling club. Frank Sakine was born in Vancouver in 1914 and married Mary Cato in 1938. Their daughter, Takako Eleanor Sakine, was born in late 1938. They came to Albert Canyon in the late 1940s, working in a sawmill, and later settled in Revelstoke. And Eleanor married Keen Hashimoto. And we've spoken to Eleanor and on an interview with her and talked about her experiences living in Revelstoke and when their family came here. The Fujiwara family, Toshiyuki Fujiwara, was living near Glacier, working as a CPR sectionman in 1946. He married Tomiko Moriwaka at Newton, Denver in December of 1945, and they had children, Jeannie, Amy, and Fred. Toshiyuki's father, Shujo, was a well-known photographer in Japan and Vancouver before being forcibly uprooted to New Denver. We've got quite a few photographs here now of the Japanese Canadian community and some of their activities within the community. The community would ask the Buddhist priest to come to Revelstoke on a regular basis and bless the graves of their families. This is Reverend Ori Fujikawa and families at the Revelstoke Cemetery around 1970. An interesting connection is that when we did the commemoration of the 1910 Rogers Pass snowslide on March 4th, 2010, and had a ceremony at Grizzly Plaza, and part of that was a Buddhist service. And Reverend Fujikawa was, at that time, was the bishop of the Buddhist church, and he came to perform that ceremony, so coming full circle and continuing his involvement with Revelstoke. There was a Japanese Canadian Citizens Association that was formed, and they had a lot of activities. They would do annual Christmas parties. Here we've got some of the men, Frank Fujino, Ryozo Takahashi, Kunio Hashimoto, and Ken Sakamoto around 1955. These are some of one of their Christmas parties, and some of the local members of the Japanese Canadian Citizens Association. There's a non-Japanese young woman playing the accordion that was Christina Fiocco, who later became a sister in the Sisters of the Atonement, Franciscan Sisters of the Atonement Order, and is part of the large Fiocco family from Revelstoke. We'd be very interested to find out who this painter is. We don't have identification on some of the people in the photographs. I believe this is Mr. Takahashi, but not everybody else is identified. So we appreciate anybody who can help us with identification. So Fred Okamura at one of the events, and several of the young girls. This is dressing for a Japanese Canadian Citizens Association parade around 1960. We've got a few of those people identified, and would be happy to learn any other names if anybody can identify anyone else in the photograph. And this was their parade float, just at the corner of Boyle and 2nd Street, just on the corner from outside of the museum. Here, just going down 2nd Street West. And it's possible that that previous photograph was preparing for this float, but we know that they often did floats in the local parades. In 1958, the Tournament of Champions, which was the big ski jumping competition, international ski jumping competition that was held on Mount Revelstoke annually, For the first time, they had Japanese ski jumpers competing. Fred Okamura, who's seen here in the front of this lower picture, traveled to Vancouver to greet them and bring them back to Revelstoke. Um, Kiyotoka Sakai, who is on the right side of the photograph, came in third overall in the A-class events on Saturday and fifth on Sunday. And Hiroshi Yoshizawa came in 12th on Saturday and third on Sunday. So it was a big event. It was very exciting for the local Japanese Canadian community to welcome the ski jumpers to Revelstoke for the first time. There was a big carnival held on the Saturday night, and Japanese consul M. Tanabe brought greetings on behalf of the Japanese skiers and people, and presented a Japanese ski pennant to the local ski club president, Archie McGuinness. In 1959, at the Tournament of Champions, they held a concert. And according to the newspaper, it says the highlight of the program came when Japan's personable young jumper, Yasui Sugiyama, announced through an interpreter that he would like to sing for the crowd. But instead of singing in Japanese, Sugiyama sang an Elvis Presley rendition of Love Me Tender in flawless English. He had spent the entire day memorizing the English words and drew a standing ovation from the surprised crowd. By 1950, the 1950s, Canada was restoring relations with Japan, and the symbol of that was a cross-country visit by Crown Prince Akihito, uh, traveling across Canada by train. He was just 19 years old at the time, and he stopped in Revelstoke. The train would stop here for about 20 minutes, and that allowed time for the locals to greet him and to have a little walk along the board, the sidewalk next to the train. So we have Crown Prince Akihito, flanked by Ryozo Takahashi and the police sergeant John Murdoch, and on the other side of the prince is the mayor at the time, Walter Hardman. He was Revelstoke mayor for about 25 years, so presided over a lot of these local events, and Mr. Shoji, Roy Shoji. So that was an exciting day for the local Japanese Canadian community. So last photograph I want to include is a photograph of this man named Taro Sakaki. He lived in Revelstoke with his family in the late 1940s. He graduated in 1948, and he illustrated the high school annual that year. And I didn't know that until I saw this photograph. His father worked as a mechanic at the OK Garage, which is just behind the museum where Signs Inc. is now. He moved to Kamloops and started a car dealership. Mr. Thoreau's father did. And Thoreau and his brothers were involved in the car dealership, the mechanics business, and they later had a Toyota franchise and then Kamloops Nissan. Mr. Sakaki was living at the care home in Kamloops and just passed away on May 2nd, 2025, only a couple of weeks after this photograph was taken. It was taken by Laura Stovall, who was visiting another former Revelstoke resident, and met Mr. Sakaki. So we were happy to be able to find out that he had illustrated that annual, because I'd always seen the beautiful illustrations on that annual, but never knew who had produced them, and learn of his story and his connection to Revelstoke. So as we end, I just want to point out a couple of resources. The Landscapes of Injustice project has been a really incredible project, which has recorded a lot of the history of the Japanese Canadians during the Second World War. And it includes a database where they have scanned all of the records that were available of the Japanese internees during the war. So anybody doing research on their family or just on general what happened to people during the war years can find a great deal of information on the site. So I highly recommend that. As you can see, there's also teachers' resources there. So encourage you to have a look at that. And the Nikai National Museum and Cultural Center in Burnaby also has a great deal of information available. There have lots of resources and information to help people who want to do further research on this story. So there was a lot of families that I didn't mention. As we mentioned, there were probably 60 families that were here at some point during the war who had been forcibly uprooted to Revelstoke or came here shortly after the war. And we're continuing our research on that. And so if anybody has any further stories, photographs they would like to share with us, we encourage you to get in contact with us. So thank you for coming today.